I feel like there's a kind of central tension, and I hope it's a productive tension in the structure of the Q, actually over the course of really 3 years, which is this difference between one set of questions that we want to ask about how quantum mechanics will be exploited, right? What will be sort of the practical applications and possibilities to constrain, in some sense, our social conceptions of reality around a more sophisticated and comprehensive understanding of the mechanics of reality. I think we've seen some pretty incredible stuff for the last day and a half. And that's always been, in some ways, on the other side of the table from those thinkers and speakers who want to see what quantum can unleash, whether metaphorically, analogically, or quite literally in its changing in how reality works. And so I think for some people that seems a bit schizophrenic. I think it actually forces both sides to take these questions a little bit more seriously. And so here, I think we have one of the best panels we've ever assembled for that particular process, in that we actually have artists and scientists, and I think in Chris's case, people who really make science and art, and raise it to the level of what I think most of us recognize as philosophy. So with that in mind, we're going to go in the order of Alexa, Chris, and John. You can look at their biographies elsewhere. I think their presentations will speak for themselves, and we can try to see if in the conversation we can put things back together again.
So this is an example of one of my paintings. It may not actually conform to what you would typically expect with a painting. It is a man, and it's painted with acrylic paint, but it's actually painted directly on top of the subject itself. All of the brushstrokes are painted directly onto the surface of his body in a way that makes it look like a two-dimensional painting of itself. And from any angle, I'm able to make a three-dimensional space appear two-dimensional. There's no Photoshop or any other tricks. It's just how I've mapped the body onto itself. And the reason why I'm here in James Fountain is because as artist in residence at the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics, and part of my project there was to have these chalkboard surfaces that all the scientists marked on, and then I selectively erased and added some lines to complete the illusion that it was a two-dimensional world. So a lot of people wonder how I came up with this idea. I didn't go to art school. I'd actually studied political science, and so I'm very keenly interested in all the conversations here. But then I became really interested in shadows. And I wanted to know what it would look like if I put black paint down on shadows and if I exaggerated them and pretty much just reduced the world to a world of shadows. So I took my friend and I painted the shadows on him in the highlights, and I realized that I had done something very interesting with space. I couldn't quite believe what was in front of me. And I decided at that point to not pursue politics and instead make my job teaching myself how to paint in my parents' basement and learning how to paint through the process of inventing this new type of illusion. I painted on things like food. It was really hard because unlike a normal canvas, my brushstrokes would get eaten by the paint and would dissolve. It was completely a fleeting experience. And every single thing that you will see in a scene is covered in paint. The shoes, the clothes, the props, the people. And then that's just a still photo from it. So it's this entire three-dimensional space that's covered in paint, and the art that ends up enduring is the photo or the video of it. The actual art has to pretty much immediately self-destruct. The paint peels off, it's washed off, and I'm just capturing this small glimpse of reality altered. And I can also create worlds that people can enter into. And so it's like this superposition of states where it's two-dimensional and three-dimensional, and it exists in both of them at the same time. And then in addition to creating worlds that people can enter into, part of it is that the subject is within the world of the art. Here I painted on myself. And so it's my self-portrait on top of the artist as both like the canvas and the creator. I also can take my art out into the streets. I love the tension in this piece where you see his feet on the concrete ground in three-dimensional space, and yet he's interacting in the two-dimensional world of the street art painting that's on the wall. And so it's flipping between 2 and 3 dimensions. In addition to taking my artwork out onto the streets and in front of painted backgrounds, I can also take it onto places like the metro. And even in front of real-world backgrounds, the two-dimensional painting effect still holds up. And it's kind of hard to wrap your brain around exactly what you're seeing because it seems like such a conflict between worlds and dimensions. And from any angle, too. That's the same man from behind. Something I've been playing with recently is what's something that my paintings can do that normal painting can't. So this is an animation I made of photographing my model in multiple poses. And then I also like using my work as a window into these other worlds. And that's actually the beach back there in Santa Monica. So that was like the only real thing in the scene, and yet it feels like it's like a poster on the wall of a painting. So that's my main body of artwork. That's what I'm here to talk about, but I'm also throwing in a little bit extra. My boyfriend Chris Hughes and I are turning our house into a fun house, and we're playing with all sorts of optical illusions in the space. So this is just a piece of paper with construction paper words cut out on it. And then when you put different color changing lights on it, it appears to self-animate, and different things pop out that you might not have noticed were there. And then the sign for our bathroom, there's just one V shape that's painted. It reflects to form a W, which then is reflected over again to form an M for men's and women's room, all cut from the same cloth. And then in our fun house, we have a special currency, and it's called the Upton. On the coins, it's laser cut out the word up, which then when rotated upside down spells DN down. And I also have it mirrored, so when you flip the coin, it's both up and down at the same time. So it's like a quantum coin flip that you just like can't win. It's in all states all at once of being up and down. And I have enough here to share with all of you guys. So you'll all get your own Uptons. And then a brief note about the Funhouse. If you're ever in LA, you guys are totally welcome to come. It's by invitation only, and you're all invited. Thank you.
I guess my role in this talk is to be something of an antithesis to Alex Wendt. I want to show you a different point of view about quantum theory that I have been developing with colleagues and friends for some number of years now. It used to be called quantum Bayesianism, and then we got tired of saying that long word and we started calling it cubism. So the Q and the B in cubism stands initially for quantum Bayesianism. It had a nice effect, actually, in that reporters finally took an interest in it because they could then use some nice cubist art in their storylines. I made this slide back here, the cubism, the big word of cubism, for the last time I came here. And I thought, well, it'd be nice to start the talk with that very slide again. So what I'd like to do in the next 14 minutes is give some hint of what this view is like, give you a hint of how it's perhaps an opposite to Alex's view. And then at the end, I hope, if I get to the end, I hope that you'll see a statement that maybe Alex would like, after all. So even though it's coming from a different side of the world, there is an overlap in some of its goals and opportunities. So cubism. The main idea behind cubism is a very simple one. The world is made of some stuff. You know, there's stuff out in the world. On the other hand, we in quantum mechanics, we physicists, always write down symbols like this, the quantum state. Now, exactly what is the role of quantum states, or the quantum state? Is the stuff of the world quantum states? Well, as far as I can tell from Alex Wendt's view, the stuff of the world is quantum states. In cubism, that's not the case. The world's made of some stuff, and then there are these things called quantum states, and the key issue is how the two relate to each other, how the stuff in the world relates to this mathematical symbol, the quantum state. We take a kind of, once upon a time I called it an epistemic view of states to do with epistemology. Now I'm calling it a doxastic view because a philosopher taught me that this was a neat word, and I leave it to all of you to look it up. But here's the point of view in a nutshell. The world's made of some stuff like the cube that I showed you a little earlier. The role of quantum mechanics is to help not it move along, the stuff out in the world move along, but rather to help us move along in relation to the stuff out in the world. So when we think of performing a quantum measurement, conceptually what we have to do is split the world into the stuff out there and ourselves. We, the ones making the gambles on the outcomes of quantum measurements. I draw the mathematical symbol, the quantum state, up next to the head to represent the fact that that symbol captures how we would gamble on the outcomes of quantum measurements. The outcomes of quantum measurements are very explicitly taken to be experiences of the gambler. So you see in this picture there are two things. There's the stuff in the world and there's the agent. The agent makes gambles on his future experiences, but without the stuff out in the world, he wouldn't have future experiences. The hands are drawn to be indicative or evocative of equipment. So instead of thinking of the measuring device as like the eye, instead one should think of it as the hands. I think maybe this is the key innovation of cubism over Niels Bohr's view. So usually we see things like this. That's some laboratory equipment that performs a measurement. From the point of view of cubism, that should really be thought of as an extension of the gambling agent. That's the agent's hands, quite literally. So let me go back to this point and again tell you about how it's an opposite point of view to Alex. Suppose that we erase the agent, the gambling agent, out of the picture. What then happens to this thing called the quantum state? So the agent's out of the picture now. There's the quantum state, there's the stuff out in the world. Well, the quantum state goes poof. It's gone. Because it's solely a function of the gambling agent. On the other hand, I would call the cubists realists. I've already said that there's some stuff out in the world. What we'd really like to do as physicists is get a handle on what's the zing, what makes it go. Why is it that we adopt the theory of quantum mechanics rather than some other formalism? Can we get a handle on that? So what is it that makes it go? It seems pretty popular now to say the stuff that makes it go is spooky action at a distance. So a good representative of this point of view is Tim Maudlin. You'll find him at every philosophy of science meeting or every philosophy of physics meeting, unfortunately. And he'll say things like, what Bell proved and what theoretical physics has not yet properly absorbed is that the physical world itself is non-local. What theoretical physics has not yet properly absorbed is that the physical world is non-local. Well, cubism takes the opposite point of view to him too. It says, say boo to spooky action at a distance. It's a bad idea. And in fact, if you look at it the right way, there's no evidence for it within quantum theory. What's the difficulty? This quote by Einstein, I think, captures it best. If one asks what is characteristic of the realm of physical ideas, Einstein said, then above all, the following attracts our attention. The concepts of physics refer to a real external world. Ideas are posited of things that claim a real existence independent of the perceiving subject. Moreover, it is characteristic of these physical things that they are conceived of as being arranged in a space-time continuum. Further, it appears to be essential for this arrangement that at a specific time, these things claim an existence independent of one another. Without such an assumption of mutually independent existence of spatially distant things, physical thought in the sense familiar to us would not be possible. Nor does one see how physical laws could be formulated and tested without such a clean separation. Just think about the laboratory that we toured the other day when they told us what great lengths they went to isolate what they were doing inside the laboratory from the outside world. Einstein's worry was, if you didn't have a notion of locality, then no matter how much isolation you gave the stuff in the laboratory, somebody sneezing across the universe could change the experiment. How can you trust the outcome of any experiment or any experimental test if somebody sneezing in a faraway galaxy is actually influencing what's going on. So this is why I would say that the idea of non-locality is a bad idea. Captain Quantum Entanglement is tickling someone from far away. But the point of view of the philosophy of science meetings is, well, then Einstein's worry must be misplaced somehow. Because after all, what Bell proved and what theoretical physics has not yet properly absorbed is that the physical world is non-local. So they toy with an idea like this. Somehow, quantum mechanics hits a sweet spot. The world is non-local. Sneezes across the galaxy really do affect what's going on in your laboratory, no matter how many millions of dollars you've pumped into isolating it. Yet somehow, by a miracle maybe, we can still do science. That's a little too finely balanced for me, and seems like there must be something wrong about the idea, if somehow the world is so finely tuned that we can have these two contradictory statements. So let me just tell you how Cubism, in the last couple of minutes, how Cubism deals with the idea that one finds in things like the Bell inequality tests and questions about non-locality. Just as I drew the diagram of something out in the world and the agent, I could have drawn it with two things out in the world. Now, where quantum mechanics seems to get mysterious is if one buys this thing that Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen said, if one can, without in any way disturbing a system, predict with certainty, i.e. with probability equal to unity, the value of a physical quantity, then there exists an element of physical reality corresponding to this physical quantity. If there's something you can do that will allow you to predict with certainty something else, and you haven't disturbed the something else, then there must be an element of reality out there corresponding to it. That was their idea. And that led to the EPR paradox that many of you know about. I won't explain it so much, but the general idea is I make a measurement on something here, and I can predict something far, far away. They pointed out that you can predict things that quantum mechanics, through the uncertainty relation, don't allow to exist together. Well, they must be elements of reality, therefore quantum mechanics is wrong. This is usually taken as a proof that, in fact, when I do something here, I am disturbing the far away thing. Tim Maudlin again makes it very clear when he says, if I could make one change to the EPR paper, in retrospect it would be to alter the characterization of this criterion. The authors call it reasonable and in agreement with classical as well as quantum mechanical ideas of reality, but its status is actually much stronger than that. The criterion is, in the parlance of the philosophers, analytic. That is, the criterion follows just from the very meanings of the words used in it. What are the words that they use in it? If one can predict with certainty, i.e. with probability equal to unity, the value of a physical quantity, then there exists an element of physical reality corresponding to it. Well, this is where Bayesianism, forget the quantum, steps in to save the day. In the subjectivist Bayesian notion of probability, probability is about gambling. When I say that an event E has some probability P sub E, like on this diagram, what I'm saying is only that I will buy a lottery ticket or sell a lottery ticket that's worth $1 if E for that amount, P sub E. So in other words, a probability is how much you're willing to buy or sell lottery tickets for. And the meaning is no deeper than that. Well, let's consider a lottery ticket worth $1 if E, and suppose that I'm willing to buy and sell it for exactly $1. That means I'm assigning probability 1 to that event. Does that mean that there must exist an element of reality that makes my gamble a good one rather than a completely insane one? No, it doesn't. So the probabilities of quantum theory, according to Cubism, are these Bayesian kinds of probabilities. The EPR criterion of reality is hardly analytic, and let me just quickly give you a picture of how one should view this. When I have two particles that are maximally entangled, I have an entangled state, and I perform a measurement on one, and I get a probability 1 outcome for the other, all it means is that I am willing to gamble my life that if I perform the measurement on the second particle, I'll get the same answer. So what is the use of the formalism of quantum mechanics? It's to help us make these gambles like that. Okay, so let me just point out a kind of similarity between that view and many worlds, though I hate to do it. But here's a nice statement of what's up with the Bell inequality derivations from the point of view of many worlds, or the Everett point of view. David Wallace writes, from the perspective of a given experimenter, of course, her experiment does have a unique outcome, even in the Everett interpretation. There is a unique outcome, even in the many worlds picture. But Bell's theorem requires more. It requires that from her perspective, her distant colleague's experiment also has a definite outcome. This is not the case in Everettian quantum mechanics, not at any rate until that distant experimenter enters her past light cone. And from the third-person perspective from which Bell's theorem is normally discussed, no experiment has any unique, definite outcome at all. So the many worlds interpretation is basically an interpretation that says nothing really genuinely happens in the world. Well, the picture that I drew of what's going on in the Einstein EPR situation is we make a measurement here, and usually we think that there's a measurement device going click, click, click on the other side. There's no warrant for that from this point of view. That looks a lot like the Everettian picture, except for this key point. Whereas they have a third-person perspective from which nothing happens, cubism says there is no such thing as a third-person perspective. And it's at that little juncture where I think the thinking of cubism matches the way that Alex has been talking, at least in the parts of his book that I've read so far. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for hanging in for our gathering here today, well into the story. Thanks to James for making this all possible. Very provocative setting for this discussion. So, the title of the talk today is Intimations of Entanglement, Prophetic Memory, and Cultural Narratives in Search of Metaphysics of the Quantum Self. This is a true story, and it's a story that really is more of an account of how I have come to inhabit a story about this search for the metaphysics of a quantum self in the course of my work. And prophetic memory here, just a brief coda because I won't spend much time talking about it except to talk about my own memory. But I'm interested in, at some point, an account of the trajectory, the arc of those voices, those perspectives, philosophers, poets, musicians, artists, who over time, from Democritus to Lucretius, William Blake, Christopher Smart, Edgar Allan Poe, have in one way or another divined aspects, almost in a kind of premonitory way, of the quantum moment that we are inhabiting. A quantum moment that is only 100 years old. And one of the interesting aspects of the story for me is to think about that journey in a kind of deep time context. So we think about this narrative emerging in deep time. So it's got an emergent aspect to it. It has some incipience about it. Maybe even in a philosophical terminology, an immanence, usually used in terms of divining the sacred or the God-oriented revelation. But something that is transpiring over time through humans, through points of view, through poetic insight, through prophetic delving. So, I want to give some props, in a sense, in the offing to that trajectory, and in part, this project has been a way of locating myself in that trajectory. The cultural narrative is really more, in a sense, the domain of autobiography, and really begins with an autobiographical journey for me in San Antonio, Texas, a Chicano from the occupied territories of the American Southwest, And the first book that I wrote that was in this vein really dealt with genealogies, but the quantum version of that increasingly for me became expressed as captured by the emerging science of genealogical genetics. And I also want to talk a little bit at the end about the emergent space of quantum consciousness. So with the first book that I did in this arena of what I've called, with a couple of our conversations here, hallucinated memoir, Places Left Unfinished at the Time of Creation, was a story of the Santos and Garcia families here spilling out of a house in downtown San Antonio in the 50s. And we carried an old story, a story that, for me to tell, meant traveling into Mexico, reconnecting with aspects of the indigenous sources of who we were in central Mexico, the ritual of the voladores, a kind of a cosmological dance pageant that's performed throughout Mexico. And also the epic of mestizaje, the cultural mixing of peoples that took place in Mexico in the aftermath of the conquest. So the first book was very much in the context of that journey into this story. The casta system of racial classification in Mexico was about trying to specify the permutations of what you got when you crossed what with what. So the paradigmatic one was the one I showed you first, the Español con Indio, but there were about 95 different permutations. Ways in which the Spanish mind, in this case, sought to identify what emerged out of these random pairings of people with these very different and vast legacies. So the story that emerged in that first book was very much about that legacy, and also the landscapes of Texas, this being a painting of an enchanted rock, a kind of sacred spot about an hour north of San Antonio. So family, history, legacy, and land. But something happened along the way that made, the discursive challenge that emerged when I began reading deeper into the tradition. I found this quote: "The prophets wrote about the future as if it were the past, and about the past as if it were yet to happen." And similarly with the present, sometimes they spoke figuratively, other times more realistically, and on occasion quite literally. One says more or less than another, or expresses it in a better way. And this is not a deconstructionist. This is the founder of the New World in the 1482, Christopher Columbus, from his Book of Prophecies. When he was brought up on charges for misappropriation of funds, he enlisted a group of monks to help him find all of the references to his life in past scriptures. And this was one of the little epigraphs that he used in that book. So Columbus, in a sense, was challenging me to think about the discursive practice of telling the story in a much more profound way, much more set in deep time, connected to the epic that had emerged not just in Mexico, but all that had preceded it, which sort of led me into the space of genetics. And photograph 51, Rosalind Franklin's X-ray spectrographic image of the DNA molecule shot from above, the one that James Watson snuck into a lecture theater in London, saw, and had an aha moment that helped him go back to Cambridge and crack the code. But when I began reading into these emerging discoveries in the field of genealogical genetics, I was challenged in a deeper way to think about connectivity and entanglement across generations, across time, among family members and ancestral legacies. This one from Matt Ridley: "There is something hard, indivisible, quantum and particulate at the heart of inheritance, an unbroken chain of copyings over 4 billion years. Copyings that cumulatively, in terms of human beings, some speculate maybe 118 human beings born up to these days. So 118 billion souls connected genealogically over time through DNA, and the key to the cracking the code, as Watson put it, was the question of how all the specificity, cumulatively, of all of these lives over time was copied into the future. So I began to see our family story much more deeply set in an ongoing transmission of information across time. And how would I tell that story? Robert Pollack was another influence, a biologist, Columbia. The notion of DNA, wrote this from Signs of Life, a book on semiotics and DNA. The notion of DNA as a text makes it possible to imagine natural selection as an author in deep time, writing at the rate of perhaps a letter every few centuries to produce the instructions for all living things we are among today. So the idea increasingly emerges in this delving into this prophetic memory of a way of connecting through bodies, ancestral bodies, over time, in which I am just the latest iteration. And I wanted to find a way to reach farther and farther back. And increasingly in some of the readings, it began to merge with elements of digital culture. What is truly revolutionary about molecular biology in the post-Watson-Crick era is that it has become digital. The machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. And at the fringe end of some of these speculations around non-locality and the quantum sphere as it relates to the human, the global network of DNA-based life emits ultra-weak radio waves, which are currently at the limits of measurement, but which we can nonetheless perceive in states of defocalization and as hallucinations and dreams. The aperiodic crystal of DNA is shaped like two entwined serpents, two ribbons, a cord or a vine. We see in our trances serpents, ladders, cords, vines, trees, spirals, crystals, and so on. So it was clear that if I wanted to write another book about my family story, I would, and I still had to do my mom's families. She was feeling left out from the first book. So I was going to have to move on to her family stories. It was going to have to be the Vitruvian Man set in this new kind of genetic context and in this deep time arena. This is a painting by a Mexicana artist friend of mine of a kind of a family portrait. She's in the middle and her two parents on the sides. So I knew that when I was going to get into this story, I was going to have to challenge myself to reach deeper into the remembrance of the before, as challenged by my mentor, Laura Riding Jackson. So my mom's family here, the Lopez's, and my grandmother, and seated my mom here on the left. It was going to be a story about them. My uncle Lico was a genealogist himself. I don't know if you can see at the top there, but this is a family genealogy. At the very top is the King of Spain. So I knew I had very rich material to work with his family. The book that emerged was called The Farthest Home is an Empire Fire. This was an image of a Goya painting, but I told the designer it should be a Goya painting as represented by a videographic artifact found in the distant future that had begun to disintegrate. And so this story began to emerge, and it was set. I had to use a quantum, what I was thinking of as a kind of quantum methodology to do it. Uncertainty in practice, how do you operationalize uncertainty? For me, it was inadvertentism and inadvertency. To be suspicious of intention, to allow things to transpire. This is very bad for meeting book deadlines, but it was a way of introducing an element of the random into my process, into this process that sought to be connected to cosmological cycles and currents set in a conjunction of the deep past and the present, the Hubble telescope and the central pyramid at Chichen Itza. And what emerged out of the process was a kind of voice, a personality named Cenote Siete. The book is co-narrated by a time-traveling ancestor from the future. He presented himself. He wasn't a construction. He was there before he identified himself. But he co-narrates this book. And Cenote Siete is a time-traveling ancestor from the future in that he announced himself to come from the very distant future, but was connecting to me through that DNA radio signal, and that he had been in contact with courses of generations in my family over many millennia. In a sense, he was describing himself as falling for centuries. And so there is a kind of interaction with this deep time genetic radio wave in the middle of the book that spans the planet and time, in that it tracks all of the great human diasporas that have linked all of us together. The farther back we go in time, the wider the shadow cast of connections to our ancestral origins. So if you watch some of these genealogical programs, or if you go online to search for your genealogical ancestors, many of them want to put forward the narrative of your connection to one particular life. But in fact, what is confounding is the totality of the lives from which we are derived. fractal, not the linear connections. And so that increasingly became the course of the narrative. All of these journeys that shaped the people that we became in South Texas, the journey that Cortés made in 1517 to 1521 to the heart of the Aztec Empire. And so the event that was described by Cenote Siete in the future, in which not only was he able to traverse time, but the entire solar system had become essentially an enclosed information system. He claims to be able to traverse the solar system as a kind of internet of sorts, a kind of a galactic internet. The event that triggers this is some kind of, it was called the Tarde de Luz, a kind of afternoon of light that was a transforming event that set people in a new kind of diaspora. People went on the roads and began to search out their origins again. So genealogical genetics for me was a way of reaching farther and farther back in time. And over the last years, I've spent a lot of time working on this particular text. It's called the Mapa de Cuautinchan #2. It's a 4 by 6 foot Chichimeca codex from the village of Cuautinchan near Puebla. And it contains, in a sense, the kind of Rosetta Stone of the Mesoamerican mythic imagination, their story of their deep time journey, out of an origin in a place called Aztlán, place of 7 watery caves, a long journey that takes them through a series of catastrophes, earthquakes, tornadoes, and tormentas of all kinds, floods, and very interestingly, an account of encounters between people that appear throughout the mapa. So the transformation is from origin through migration, encounters with others that are transformative. The ancestors that are represented in this mapa eat corn and acquire the power of speech. And so it's a record of a kind of a quantum shift in their consciousness, a way of becoming able to interact with others in a new and more powerful way that resonates into the present with the lives that we lead in South Texas. So I just want to get to the concluding section here, which is really about this question of genealogical genetics being able to capture this deep time entanglement with ancestral origins and the extent to which that, especially through storytelling, can be actualized, can be manifested. The various transforming moments of people still on the march in the lands that I come from, across an increasingly militarized border. And it has direct implications in the deep time to come, if we think about it in terms of a kind of an emergent human ethic. If we come from everywhere, in the sense of that genealogical genetics testifies to, then there may be an emergent human ethic, a right to be anywhere. And if there is a right to be anywhere, then no border will stand, not just the US-Mexico border. This is not something that's going to transpire in the next 100 years, or maybe even the next 500 years. This is the deep time of Cenote Siete. And the other emergent space of this quantum consciousness shift that I just want to end with is to think a little bit about the aspect of the Cenote Siete story in which he says essentially we became a part of the quantum flow of the digital streams. We became embedded in all that which was, for our time, a kind of a modeling, a kind of premonitory modeling of a new way of being human. We're rehearsing quantum consciousness, in a sense, through our interaction with digital tools, and with a couple of features to them. Ubiquity. The idea that our access to this information stream into the past and into the future is ubiquitous, that our point of contact with it is always marked by instantaneity, simultaneity. It has the feature of infinite searchability, something that was very interestingly, very profoundly foregrounded in Ex Machina, and the figure of Eva in Ex Machina. And then increasingly the transparency of the interface, maybe even the embeddedness of the interface to come. I mean, there's some interesting recent writing about whether we are at the threshold of our brain's capacity, the wetware, to produce significantly more intelligence, significantly faster streams of thought. I don't know whether Anibar? Yeah, whether there's any talk about whether we can increase our scan rates on our brain, short of developing faster neurons and other aspects of wetware. But our interaction with our digital technology is a kind of a rehearsal for the world that Santos is describing, or at least that he described to me. And I want to just point out that with Santos, the work emerged before I had any of these thoughts. It really was a kind of an instruction, maybe like a channeled material of sorts. He claimed to be descended from me. I didn't have any children. I do now. And she was born on the day the book was published. So very spooky. I don't know if it's spooky action at a distance, but spooky. The protean aspect of this projective idea of the human that emerges out of this story was forecast by Carlos Fuentes in his beautiful book, The Varied Mirror. Does it not raise the possibility that everything in this world is unfinished, and that more specifically, we are unfinished ourselves, men and women who cannot be declared complete, enclosed within boundaries of finitude and certainty, unfinished even when we die, because forgotten or remembered, we do contribute to a past that our descendants must keep alive if they are to have a future. Deep quantum entanglement in a very old-fashioned Mexican way from Carlos Fuentes. I'll end right there. Thank you.